This House supports a people's democratic right to secede. Let me state that again. This House supports a people's democratic right to secede. At this point, I would like to step aside, and proposing the motion, I invite the first speaker from West Los Angeles, Violet.
Hi everyone, we'd like to start with some thank yous from our team. First, we would like to thank the National Speech and Debate Association and our Arizona host for this tournament. This tournament is the culmination of years of practice, hard work, and education in this activity, and as grateful as we are to be here in this final round stage, we are even more grateful to have the opportunity to participate in a community as enriching as the one that NSDA has nurtured. This year, we were lucky to have such an incredible support network on our team. In particular, the team moms we had this year, James' mom, Jenny, and his grandparents, Audrey's mom, Janice, and her aunt, Peyton, Brandon's wife, Kat, and my own mom, Diana. This incredible crew of amazing women kept us fed, energized, and are largely responsible for us being here this afternoon. We can never thank them enough. As West Los Angeles Violet, we are very proud to thank our coach, Brandon Batham, who is just about the most generous, patient, kind, tenacious, and selfless coach we could have asked for. Thank you, Brandon, for your endless humor and sarcasm that really made this experience everything we could have hoped for. With that, we also have two incredible teammates, James and Audrey, who are not on the stage with us today, but we're also hoping to thank quite a few people. James would like to thank his mother for everything she does and for letting him get here. He would also like to thank his grandparents and aunts, Carol Chong and April Miller, for their constant support. He wants to thank Madeline Maddox Walker and Laura Novak for their support. He would also like to thank his coach, Brandon and Tia. Without them, he would definitely not be here. He would like to thank Westlake High School and his debate team for their encouragement. He thanks his teammates on West Los Angeles Violet as well. Audrey would like to thank her mother, father, sister, first and foremost, for always believing in her and supporting her. She would also like to thank her Aunt Peyton, Mrs. Huang, and Pastor David for prayer for her. She wants to thank her coaches, Mr. Olmstead and Brandon, as well as Dr. Rubio for sending her to nationals. She wants to thank and express her gratitude for Raina, Astor, and Sirkin for always helping her out in debate. And finally, she wants to thank her teammates, both on West LA and on Fullerton. She couldn't have done this without you. For my own thank yous, firstly, I'd like to thank my mom and my dad, who have been so deeply supportive of all of my dreams, one of which was getting to this stage. My younger sister, Mickey, you inspire me and everyone around you daily. And I can't forget the most supportive grandparents, aunts, and uncles anyone could have asked for. I love you so much. Thank you to my coaches at Nova 42, Coach Murray, Coach Mike, and Coach Ted, who have helped me from day one of my debate journey. My advisors and mentors at La Cañada High School, Mr. Valacides, Mr. Lively, Mr. Cardinal, Mr. Sullivan, and Dr. Hernandez. Thank you for your daily inspiration and guidance. Alex would like to thank his mom, who has been his rock and source of emotional support and love for 17 years, the most hardworking, dedicated, committed, day in and day out mom in the world, and has sacrificed everything in her life for him. His mom, without whom Alex would be absolutely nothing. He'd like to thank some of his best friends back home, Oren, Luke, Jack, Ian, both Jacksons, Max, and Zoe. He would also like to thank Team USA this year, who has been like a found family for him, with whom he has felt more loved and at home than he ever has. Sungju, Ollie, Anvika, Sophia, Vin, Kira, Eric, Anish, Chelsea, Diane, and Roberto. Mihika would like to thank her parents first and foremost for their constant support and encouragement throughout the past 18 years. She couldn't have accomplished any of what she has without their unwavering faith in her. She would also like to thank every single member of Burbank's High School speech and debate team for making the team a true family for the past 4 years, especially Alexis, Delia, and Edna, who made all 6 hours of this road trip here so fun. Thank you to Brandon for letting her bask the weekend every morning. And finally, she'd like to thank all of the West LA Violets, me, Alex, Audrey, and James, who she's only known for a few months, but knows she has a lifelong bond with. Lastly, we would like to thank the greater World Schools debate community. At this tournament and throughout this season, we have felt the positive spirit of competitiveness and collaboration that continues to flourish in the world's competitive circuit. From the larger-than-life World Schools debate bedrock in America that is Texas, to the fierce and robust competitors we find on the international circuit, like our friends here from Singapore, China, Mexico, Canada, Taiwan, and Ghana. Our community has acted like a whetstone to us, sharpening and empowering us to be better and more effective debaters. It is to that community that we say thank you. This round is for you. Secession is not an act of rebellion, but a proclamation of autonomy, a declaration that a people's aspirations cannot be contained within the confines of a rigid status quo. As we witness millions of people suffer worldwide from the shackles of oppression, abuse, and cultural disconnect, we stand by their right to break their chains free. Thus, we are so incredibly proud to propose the motion, "This House supports a people's democratic right to secede." What can you expect in this speech? Firstly, some top-level notes on framing to set up this debate for you, and secondly, 2 substantive arguments from proposition side of the House. With that, a few key framing points to start. Firstly, what necessarily is a democratic right? We would tell you that a right is inherent to a person by virtue of them being human. Democratic rights exist within a democratic society. It is within that context that we interpret this motion. To further understand this, we would urge you to consider other examples of democratic rights, including the right to dissent, protest, and vote for one's leaders. Second note on framing, though, what do we need to prove to you to win this debate? Note that our burden is to establish that there is indeed a legitimate right for people to secede, grounded in principles of self-determination, democracy, and human rights. Thus, on our side of the House, we establish the principle and demonstrate the advantages of recognizing the right to secede. Panel, we do not need to demonstrate that the right to secede should be executed in all situations consequentially. That is to say, we do not need to defend the unreasonable use of the right to secede and are not obligated to provide a detailed plan for how secession would be carried out in every specific case. Third and final note on framing, though, opposition must meet a prerequisite burden in order to even enter this debate in the first place. Why is this? Recognize that democracies functionally allow people to decide what they want, to produce democratically legitimate conclusions. So, in the instance that a people want a secession, opposition must provide a robust justification as to why that decision was democratically illegitimate in the first place. That was a prerequisite burden they needed to address before furthering any other sort of argumentation. With that, let's move into our first 2 substantive arguments. Our first substantive is the principle of self-determination. The thesis of this argument is as follows. People have an intrinsic, inalienable right to self-determination, and on a motion that asks us to debate if we would support the right to secede, we think that fundamentally requires an analysis of why there exists a principal justification for secession. 3 key layers of analysis within this argument then. Firstly, on consent. When people enter contracts to form governments, they consent to being ruled and to being subjected to the conditions of things like citizenship and laws. Crucially, though, in the same way that consenting a single time to something does not mean that you consent to that thing indefinitely, secession represents the capacity for individuals to rescind their consent from a specific government. The alternative on their side of the House, though, looks like secessionary groups being perpetually subjugated under a broad, overarching government that they can never remove themselves from. So this is just like the right that you should have to quit your job if you feel like you're being mistreated or underpaid. For instance, South Sudan grew wary of the human rights abuses and exploitation that did occur in Sudan, so they seceded to escape that oppression. Second note here, though, is on autonomy. When your personhood and existence are infringed upon, you always have the principal right to defend yourself. That is to say, secession enables the agency to stop infringement of your rights. Note that secession is entirely consistent with the bedrock theory of democracy, that if a people will something to be done, it must be. So when you democratically vote to secede, that was principally analogous with voting for any other action in other respects. The core genesis of humanity is an individual's ability to act as a moral agent and engage with the world in a way that is autonomous. Crucially, this self-determination is a tenet of both individual autonomy and collective autonomy, which is to say that singular people are principally justified in exercising their right to autonomy by voting for secession. But a secessionary state would also be inherently valid in asserting its self-determination as an independent one. Thirdly, though, on principal retribution, the broad reason why people secede is that they are fundamentally dissatisfied with their current conditions, and this breaks down into 3 cases. 1, some level of oppression or injustice was waged against them, whether it be a historical grievance or current ethnic suppression. 2, they believe the state has failed them in providing the basic requirements and conditions for life, which is to say that they live in economic destitution, are subjugated to mass incarceration without trial, or are violently threatened by their own nation's military. 3, they are experiencing some form of cultural disconnect that they do not associate with the collective history or mutual identity of the nation, that they feel as if they do not resonate with their flag or national tradition. But in all cases, secession meant retribution, whether it be for actively oppressive wrongs on part of the government or historical disconnects and quashing of identity. What were the impacts of this argument? Firstly, this principle operates at a higher level. That is to say, this argument should be independent and a priori of any consideration of the practical. Secondly, by upholding the sanctity of consent, secession recognizes the supremacy of individual sovereignty over the coercive powers of the state. It amplifies the voice of the individual, allowing them to exercise their moral agency and shape their own destiny, unfettered by the arbitrary constraints of a centralized authority. Before I introduce our second substantive argument, I can take a point.
We would note that individual solvency should not be the end goal of a democracy at the point where democracy is about community.
We would tell you that the democratic right to take any sort of vote and take an action from that vote would be something that was principally justified in such like people are deciding to do things and preserve their autonomy in that matter. Let's move in our second substantive argument, which is the fundamental right to secede and how that is better for all. The thesis of this argument is that in times of injustice, secessions crucially ensure better conditions on both the individual and collective level. That explains the practical justification for supporting the right to secede. There are 3 key layers of analysis under this argument. 1, to characterize the injustices that serve as a catalyst for secession. Political abuses of power, institutional discrimination, human rights abuses, so on and so forth, all of these violations of fundamental rights are motivations for groups to secede. Secondly, secession provides a peaceful mechanism for resolving conflicts, preventing violence. So when a group within a state feels marginalized or oppressed, secession can be a means of preventing civil unrest, ethnic tensions, and armed conflicts. Thirdly, even if secession fails, in our very worst case, a devolution of powers within the state occurs. The central government gradually transfers its power to the local government. This is because attempted secession creates an Overton window effect, which is to say that individuals' worldviews are increasingly adoptive of the values and beliefs they witness. So for instance, Scottish independence was originally seen as irrational, but now, after strong discussions of secession, it is something that about half of the population supports. Bottom line here is simple. Op's best ground still comes below our worst ground. Ultimately, when secession occurs, there was a twofold impact. 1, dissatisfied groups can peacefully split from the parent nation and reduce the chances of ethnic conflict and civil unrest. But 2, even if secession fails, the very nature of seceding is presented as a new radical as shown with the Overton window effect. That presents the idea of self-autonomy for the separating body as something more moderate and reasonable, allowing for further gains in the future. In the tapestry of nations, let us weave a thread of self-determination, allowing communities to unshackle themselves from the chains of oppression and injustice. It was on this basis we were incredibly proud to propose.
The chair would like to thank the proposition for their perspective on this motion, but I am certain that that is not the only perspective that is out here. I now invite the first speaker for the opposition to present their view.
Before I begin, Team Hoosier Crossroads would like to extend a few thank yous before we start speaking. So first, thank you to the National Speech and Debate Association as well as the Phoenix Mesa area for letting us be here this week. This week has been an amazing experience for everyone involved, and we are just so thankful that we have been able to have it. Second, we would like to all thank our parents for endless years of support in our pursuit of speech and debate. Thank you also to the Indiana debate community for not only fruitful competition, but support every single Saturday. Thank you to J.D. Ferris Rowe of Brebeuf Jesuit High School, Parker McMillan of Carmel High School, Linda and Michael Langford of Avon High School, and especially Jeannie Malone of Cathedral High School for building our debaters up and supporting the team. Lastly, the team also wants to thank all of the advocates working tirelessly to fight the recent onslaught of homophobia and transphobia in Indiana. Thank you for reminding us of the importance of our event, not only within these walls, but in our communities. With that, I will go ahead and begin. From the pages of history to the contemporary world, we have had a magnitude of voices calling out against the injustices in their worlds and fighting to be heard. But it is because we uplift peace and order over violent extremism that we are so proud to stand in opposition today. In this speech, just 3 things. First, offering some refutation of the propositions case that they provide you in their first speech. Second, offering some pieces of framework to guide today's debate. And lastly, going through the opposition's first 2 substantive arguments. My partner Caroline will present our third. So first, right off the bat, in their speech, the proposition gives you in their framework that they don't need practical impacts if they can say that principally having people with the right to secede looks better in their world. We would tell us that if they can't tell us what happens in their world, if they can't lay out the practical impacts of their world, we would be able to win this debate because we show you what practically happens in our world and why that is better and why that is preferred. Now moving on to their first substantive argument, the principle of self-determination. They tell you that people join governments, they consent to these governments, these governmental ideas and the government's ideas of citizenship towards them. But we would like to say that because people leave democratic societies, often leave to rebel against it, their points of secession ensuring peace and ensuring better conditions don't really stand. We would say practically in our world, a lot of secession has caused violence, a lot of secession has caused war, and we would tell you that their points about secession leading to more peace don't really stand. Because at the point where in our world we have seen secession lead to large amounts of violence, we would say that they can't simply fiat and say, because secession is good for democracy, it doesn't lead to violence. That doesn't stand. They paint a really optimistic picture of why people leave as well. They say people leave because they don't feel heard in their democracies. They say people leave because they don't like the government that they are in. And we would say this is true some of the time, but a lot of the time people leave a nation because of ethnic differences. They leave a nation because of historical differences. They don't leave nations all the time because they feel that their democracies are threatened or that their rights are threatened. We would tell you that they are painting an optimistic picture. We are painting a realistic picture of what secession actually looks like. Now moving on to their second substantive argument, that saying secession ensures better conditions for the people in them. We would tell you that they are again mischaracterizing why people secede at the point where a lot of people are seceding for ethnic differences in their countries and because they feel that they are ethnically different than the rest of their nation. We would tell you that a lot of secession leads to war, it leads to things like famine in these countries, and it leads to worse conditions, very different than what the proposition would have you believe. We also say that if we pass something that helps a small amount of people, we would rather have something that helps the majority of people in a world. For example, if we passed a law that helped a small amount of people, this is not great and preferred at the point where it hurts the majority and at the point where it hurts most people. We will get into that more in our argument. Now moving on to framework. 2 pieces here. First, we would characterize the success and functionality of a democratic right by its ability to uphold democracy at large. We would say that in the long term, if a right hurts democratic practices, the immediate values of that right should be outweighed by the ultimate loss of democracy that would ensue. And this right is no longer inherently a democratic right. Secondarily, we would say that the alternative to democratically voting for secession looks like negotiations between people and governments. We say this happens in our world because there are times when secession is valued by both sides. And in these times, secession can be achieved unanimously. However, we would argue that a democratic right to secede does not look like this at the point where it would only require one side needed to secede, obviously those who are seceding. Now moving on to our first substantive argument, social contract. The thesis of this argument is that secession as an idea, absent any practical impacts, fundamentally violates the social contract and thus is not a democratic right. So why is this? 2 layers here. First, we would tell you that secession fundamentally disrupts the social contract at the point where it treats democratic rights as though they are a math equation. Secession oftentimes will cause nation states to react in ways that violate the democratic rights of other individuals in that nation in order to cope with the seceding state. It does not matter if 52% of a nation state wants to secede if this is going to violate 48% of individual rights. In any democratic society, no democratic right can be predicated on the harms of other people's access to democracy. Second, even if you don't buy this majority argument, we would tell you that feeding undemocratic notions of secession that often happen is bad. We would say that people seceding from democratic nations are seceding from democratic ideals and is thus principally regrettable. incredible. So when the proposition tells you that their world happens only in democracies, people only secede in democracies, and that democratic rights are only ensured in democracies, we would tell you when people secede, they are inherently going against these democratic values and principles. Now our second substantive argument, secession is not always just. The thesis of this argument is that, very minutely, secession does not always have a desirable impact long term. However, at the point where we see most secession being based on factors such as historical and ethnic differences, people would secede on these metrics when given the right, yet their new nation would be hurt in the long term. So where do we think secession tends to happen? We think that on a fundamental level, secession is more likely to occur in more politically and or economic unstable areas. See East Timor, see Cyprus, see Western Sahara. However, you would seem to disagree.
Opposition indicts secession as violent. Panel, even if self-defense is violent, that would not negate your right to that.
We would tell you that at the point where proposition continuously says that they value the quality of life, we would value people's ability to live in a safe area. We would value people's ability to live in an area where there is not active warfare happening. And at the point where a large amount of secession leads to this warfare, we tell you the opposition world is preferred if we look at the metrics of quality of life that proposition continues to tell you matter. Now, here that the proposition can't only look at more relatively stable places such as Catalonia and such as Taiwan and give you examples of why secession works as a whole, because secession only works in stable places, if at all. We think that it would be ultimately detrimental for relatively unstable nations to secede, and we believe this on a few levels, so let's get into the layers of analysis here. First, we would say that it is the moral obligation of this House to safeguard the well-being and prosperity of all citizens. What this means is that it would be morally unjust to support the democratic right to secede at the point where by seceding, the minority group committing the secession is being benefited and the majority population will face detriments. We actually see this in the case of Catalonia. At the point that Catalonia is one of the largest contributors to Spain's GDP, if it succeeds, this will yield maybe potential benefits for Catalonia, but the overall impact would be a net negative as the economy and population of Spain would suffer. This will almost definitely look like instability on the part of both the original nation and the nation that is seceding. This brings us nicely into our second layer of analysis, which is instability. We see this instability on two accounts, first political and second economic. At the point in which we see an unstable nation secede, this House additionally sees the exacerbation of political instabilities. This stems from international relations as international support lies with the original nation over the seceding one in the case of unstable nations. This means that because both pre-established embassies and past precedents still remain with a progenitor, in the case of Somaliland, a region that gained autonomy from Somalia, it garnered no international support. As Somalia, the original country, had both embassies and relations with global bodies such as the United States and the United Nations. This has the pragmatic impact of limiting a country's international interactions, namely trade. A region seceding from a bigger one is going to lose alliances which will hurt their economy. Second, looking at politics, we would see that at the point where an unstable nation secedes, this House observes economic debilitation. This comes from aforementioned political isolation. As a new nation lacks access to other bodies, it additionally loses access to these bodies when it comes to trade. Trade and exports being an important source of economic fuel for unstable nations. Once again, look at Somaliland. The vast majority of its economics come from international trade, and so in a world which it secedes and loses access to its political allies that give it trade, this squanders the vast majority of its economic capacity. And for these reasons, I could not be more proud to oppose today. Thank you.
Now that both sides have laid out their perspectives and their viewpoints, I would like to invite the proposition second speaker to come forward and continue their side.
Secession is not an act of rebellion, but rather a proclamation of autonomy, a declaration that a people's aspirations cannot be contained within the confines of a rigid status quo, a status quo where the state is a tyrant, where it can tax, imprison, and punish its people. That was only conscionable if we can vote for who wields those instruments of unlimited violence in the first place. but for the Moro Muslims in the Philippines, for the Balochistan in Pakistan, and countless historically disenfranchised communities victimized to state repression, they never once consented to their oppression, and even if they did, the government was the one who violated those terms to begin with. In that instance, we think it is perfectly, principally legitimate to opt out of social contracts in the very first place. On those grounds, I'm extremely proud to propose. A couple of things I want to do in this speech. Firstly, just some quick refutation of opposition case material. Secondly, rebuilding some of the arguments that Cammie brings to you in first, before finally introducing our third and final substantive argument. Okay, let's start with some refutation then. The very first thing they tell you in framing is that, on our side of the house, we're going to get things like negotiations, because apparently these structurally oppressive governments are likely to reach out and behave like Mother Teresa against these subjugated communities. It was really unclear how they were actually going to do this in the first place, what kinds of incentives really existed to begin with, and it was also incredibly unclear what this looked like in the first place. What is a negotiation between minorities who are fundamentally stripped of their rights versus majoritarian parties who can strip them of those rights in the first place? Do they come to a table together? Do they shake hands and form agreements? It was really unclear what this even looked like. Second thing I want to mention, though, is on their first substantive argument of, quote, disrupting social contracts. Again, we say things like consent can be revoked. You opted into that contract in the first place. By the way, in a lot of instances, minority communities don't necessarily do that. But even if they did opt into it, now, because the government broke the terms of that agreement, because they are not actually fulfilling their duty and obligation to distribute resources in a way that is good, to actually protect you and guarantee you the rights that you wanted as a citizen, you are now legally, the same way you would be with actual contracts, allowed to back out of those and disrupt those very contracts. We thought that was principally justified. Second substantive they brought to you was on how secession was not always just because of things like instability. They say, we should safeguard the prosperity of all citizens, so if a minority group benefits, like Catalonia, the majority is harmed. That was wrong. First of all, we told you about the principle of historical retribution. We told you that on a practical level, if we cannot fulfill and safeguard everyone on either side of the house, which group should we prioritize? It should be the most vulnerable. It should be the individuals who don't actually have the mechanisms or the agency or autonomy to safeguard themselves. Those are the individuals we should be prioritizing. That is the very simple way that answers their argument. The second thing I want to notion to you is that they tell you that secessionist movements are unlikely to secede, and that essentially they're going to be very, very unstable. Note that first, a right to secede is probably principally justifiable and thus independent of any of the practical harms that they're going to fearmonger. Secondly, note that we support weakening the power of things like imperial states who are most likely to be impacted by secessionist movements. Thirdly, even if OP claims that most benevolent states are negatively impacted, in these cases, we think a democratic right to secede is accompanied by things like meaningful and long-running negotiations on our side of the house between the affected parties to limit any negative effects. This means that transitions are not rapid or sudden or suddenly unstable, and anticipated consequences can probably be addressed. Cooperation is actually likely to increase on our side within regions between secessionist states and their former unions when secessionist states have increased autonomy, when they control over their own natural resources, and when they have competitive advantages that spur things like economic exchange and cooperation between the two parties without grievances of disenfranchisement. Crucially, that secessionary state is now also enabled politically to form their own alliances, to form alliances with countries that they previously did not have access to because of their parent nation structurally stopping that. We would support things like that. We would support things like international funding, like recognition. We think that's inherent to the phrase "this House supports" in the motion, which is to say that we not only principally support that right, and we would actually back it on a moral level, but we would also support it as a House in general. We would also support it as an international community with things like recognition in the UN, but also practically with things like funding and support. I'll take you.
Say that at the point where they have characterized these governments as like evil and awful, they have to show you why those same governments on their side of the house are suddenly going to engage in this benevolent conversation.
First of all, it did not matter whether those governments wanted to engage in benevolent conversation with us at all. What mattered was the principal right for these people to leave places that they are fundamentally being oppressed in. What mattered was that they were able to conglomerate and actually form their own governances, and it didn't matter if the majority government hated that, or if they didn't want to talk to us, or if they wanted to isolate us. That was not something we were concerned with. The second thing I want to mention, though, is that all of their refutation from opposition first is contingent on a single argument, this gesticulating about war and violence, yet it's highly unclear how war and violence actually happens. They don't really mechanize this. We would tell you on the practical matters issue that we are not debating whether, for instance, like practical matters or principal matters are the only consideration in the round. We say both probably have a stake, but we've given you enough weighing in the first 8 minutes and in my second speech, and we're going to continue to do so as to why the principle needs to come a priori. For instance, what is some of that weighing? We would tell you, analogously, we don't decide or determine whether an election is legitimate after we see the results of that election and after we think about whether we individually agree with the results of that election in the first place. We would say there was a principal initial a priori prerogative to guarantee those rights to vote in the very first place, even if it does result in policies that we might not actually like to begin with. Second thing they tell us in terms of reputation was that, sometimes people are going to leave because of ethnic differences. Your side characterizes this as very, very wrong. We agree that sometimes people leave because of ethnic differences or a fundamental disconnect with their national collective identity. We thought that was another instance of things like suppression by the government, because the government is forcing them to adhere and become homogeneous with that national identity in the very first place. They had the principal right to probably secede from that. Final thing they say, again, direct quote from opposition I thought was interesting, was let's not pass policies that help small groups of people if it hurts the majority. Oh, okay, so let's not do reforms of things like the criminal justice system, which are going to hurt, yes, a small group of people living in districts and neighborhoods that have mass incarceration. Let's not end things like AAPI violence in the United States because it's only going to help a small group of people. I don't think this line of reasoning was very valid from them. Final thing I want to do then is very, very simple, third substantive argument on why secession strategically weakens imperial states. The thesis of this argument is that secession was an instrument to actively deconstruct and weaken bad actors. We told you imperial states are characterized by, first, expansionist ambitions, where a central ruling power extends its authority over various territories, often distant from the diverse people they control. Second, these states exercise political, economic, and military dominance over their subject territories, employing hard and soft strategies like colonization, annexation, and the imposition of their systems on other states. Third, imperial states typically seek to establish control over resources, over trade routes and strategic locations, aiming to enhance their own power and influence at the expense of others, often stealing territory for resources or strategy. That implicitly answers their economic stability argument because the comparative they need to defend on their side of the house is actually far worse. How does secession weaken imperial states then? Two mechanisms. One, when a territory secedes, it takes with it valuable resources, assets, and industries. The loss of these resources can have a detrimental impact on the economy of the larger union, leading to things like decreased productivity and financial instability. We turn that argument on our side. Second, the secession of a territory may result in the loss of strategic geographic barriers that previously contributed to things like the overall security and geopolitical strategy of the Union. The division of military resources, intelligence sharing, and coordination of defense efforts can also become far more complex, diminishing the collective strength to respond effectively to security challenges, because our side of the house is the only one that holds the key to these prisons. Very proud to propose.
As we continue our conversation and our examination of this topic, I would like to ask the opposition speaker number 2 to come forward.
Let's break the chains free. This is a sentiment used by side proposition over and over again during their case, and especially during their first speech. It is because we on opposition understand that secession from a country does not only not break the chains free, but make them stronger, and because we value providing people with mechanisms for actually successful democratic nations that we are so proud to oppose. In this speech, I'm just going to be going over a few things. First, I'll be going over a few brief notes on Frame before diving into all of their substantive arguments and then going back to defend our own before finally going back and stating our third and final substantive argument. So let's jump straight into Frame. The first thing I want to talk about is this idea of practicality and principle arguments that we have on both sides of the House. During their framework in the proposition's first speech, they say that you should always prefer the principle over the practical, but we would fundamentally disagree with this. We would say you judge an action's morality based on how it impacts communities and how it impacts the people around you. In this instance, we have to look at practical examples that we provide to you on side opposition in order to determine whether or not secession is good or bad, therefore whether or not you judges should sign your ballot for opposition or proposition. We think that you should look at practicality with just an even lens as principally that you do in this round today. The second thing I want to talk about
was about our counterplan. During our counterplan, we talk about how it's not a ridiculous idea about cooperation and negotiation. We understand that it's not always susceptible and doesn't always work in a lot of cases, but it is a better alternative than war would be, which, make no mistake, judges, the proposition would be supporting in this world today. We understand that any kind of secession, if it is not characterized as extremely peaceful, would lead to some sort of conflict, would lead to some sort of war, if not initially, then later, when tensions between those two places rise to a level that we cannot contain anymore. Next, something I want to talk about was their substantive argument, because I think it runs in pretty well. So let's talk about the principal arguments at hand today. There's substantive one of self-determination. This clashes directly with our first substantive argument regarding the social contract. We understand this fundamental idea of consent within self-determination, but we also understand that idea of consent goes both ways when we're talking about people in a civilization and especially people in a democracy. We understand that consent is granted from a person to their country when they gain citizenship to that country. But we also understand that person gives consent to every other person in that nation to act in a democratic fashion. We understand that consent can be rescinded by an individual, but it cannot be rescinded on behalf of someone else. And that is what we are seeing on side proposition in today's round. We are seeing that every single time that they say that consent can be rescinded by an individual on behalf of someone else, they are subjecting an individual who does not want the secession, may not want a civil war, or any kind of conflict at all, to every single harm and every single detriment they list within the first substantive argument of oppression, economic destitution, and self or cultural disconnect. We see that these issues that are born because of cultural succession or country succession are non-unique because they still apply to people in that country who did not want that secession in the first place. By this, they are inherently violating the social contract, which we lay out to you in our principal argument is so important in today's debate. We understand principle and practical arguments are both important, and we think we win on a principle level as well as practical. With that being said, let's move on to more of the practical arguments, which includes their substantive two about better conditions being assured. Within this, they talk about the idea of self-autonomy, essentially saying that this self-autonomy promotes better games. And we would say the exact same argument that we just stated, that self-autonomy is not self-autonomy anymore when it infringes on other people's rights. This inherently violates the social contract that we have told you is so important in today's debate. The side proposition is not accounting for the people who do not want to secede, while side opposition does. That being said, I want to move into the third substantive argument, talking about weakening imperial states. We understand that on our side of the house, we are not supporting imperial states in any kind of way, and we do not prefer a world that oppresses and acts violently towards other countries simply because they own them. We do not think this kind of state should be supported on either side of the house, especially not on opposition. We understand that the proposition in today's debate loses on a couple different fronts. One, they don't account for the fact that other people are living in these nations that they are so ready to divide and succumb to conflict and war. Two, they do not understand that many of the different imperial nations they talk about are doing the oppression and are doing the violence that they say they do not support in any means whatsoever. We see that we have to acknowledge every single person's democratic right if we are to act morally in a society which we propose in today's world, and which is why you judges should vote on side opposition in every single side when it comes to the clash presented by the proposition. With that being said, I want to move a bit into our third substantive argument today. So let's talk about quality of life and safety, because I think this runs a little bit more into their first substantive arguments too, directly clashing with it. The thesis of this argument is that secession can exacerbate the problems by perpetrating violence in both cases of secession and even unsuccessful secession. There are two layers on this. The first one is that when a country secedes, it is expected that confusion and chaos may ensue, as with the formation of any entirely new structure of government, economics, and society. The problem occurs when the seceded country is unsustainable for life, therefore poses no benefit for its own people. Let's look at past precedent of secession to see exactly what this looks like. Following secession of South Sudan from Sudan in 2011, which resulted in violent protests, economic turmoil leading to food shortages and ravaging poverty, making South Sudan no longer a country, but a place to flee from. This is not a one-off case, but rather a larger example of the heavily militarized and stringent nature behind newly acquired independence that we see behind secession as a concept. Most cases of secession are revolved around ethnic and religious ideas, as my first speaker, Liam, pointed out to you. Therefore, issues of economics and politics that create physical quality of life for people are split. Before I go into the second layer of analysis on that, I'd love to take a point.
Panel, if there's ethnic violence in a state, it is true that splitting those groups does create stability.
So 2 notes on this. First, we will note that not all ethnic conflicts have to do with the government, but rather the people. We do not always see the government necessarily oppressing the people, but rather the majority over the minority. We do not see the government being held responsible at this point. Number 2, when it comes to different reasons of ethnic violations against a country or against a group of people, we understand that secession is not the answer, because it simply will lead to more violence and more chaos in that country. We see no world in which this can be supported by side proposition or by anyone on this stage today. That being said, let me move into our second layer of analysis. Because even if you don't buy that secession leads to violence and poor quality of life, we can see that even the threat of secession can lead to collapse. At the point where people rise up against a state and just threaten to secede, the dangers these individuals subject themselves to are fatal. Additionally, it is important to note that due to the wording of the motion today, this is an issue of the people versus the state. We understand this to be an unequal fight. Violence that a state can enact is so much more potent, as they have money and resources to wipe out entire populations if they are persuaded to do so. We do not think that a democratic right would lead to a fundamental lack of autonomy when it comes to power, at the point where autonomy is essential to democracy. For these reasons, judges, we see no ballot except in the opposition. Thank you.
After 4 speeches, one might assume that this topic has been thoroughly examined. However, the chair suspects that both sides still have comments that they would like to make, and therefore will call the third proposition speaker forward.
To deny the right to secede is to deny the very essence of democracy by imprisoning communities within borders that stifle their aspirations and shackle their dreams. Because the opposition is upholding a stance that is principally unjust, and because the proposition seeks to uphold these fundamental values, we are so proud to continue to propose. Just 2 courses of action in this speech, namely reviewing the framing and then reviewing the 2 key clash questions that this debate has boiled down to. So first, let's review some points on framing. Firstly, I'd like to characterize what a democratic right necessarily is. We told you all the way back in our first speech that a right is inherent to a person and grounded in self-determination, democracy, and fundamental rights. With this, we would tell you that the principle would come a priori to the practical as we analyze whether this is a right, and that our side only needed to prove that this is a legitimate right, not that it would be consequentially successful in every single case. Secondly, what alternatives do people have if not secession? Alex made it very clear to you in his speech why negotiations are unlikely to happen without secession. So when the opposition comes up here and tries to tell us that in their world, they're accessing all of the possible potential benefits of secession through negotiations and table talks, this is simply not the case. Because, firstly, it is the case that even when when secession is attempted, that means that every other avenue of peacefulness, of acquiring peace and stability, has already been attempted. As we told you in our first speech, secession is often a last resort type of attempt. But secondly, even if in their world that is the case, secession provides a state with actual power to negotiate into the future. While in their case, there is no negotiating body that is present. With secession, we have a unified front in this case. With that being said, let's move into the two key clash questions that this debate has boiled down to and explain why exactly your vote is with the proposition. So first, we have to look at which side actually helps seceding individuals. Because as we tell you in our very first speech, people only secede when their fundamental rights have been violated, their inalienable rights as guaranteed to them by the government. At that point, the proposition is the only side actively helping these individuals. The only measure of solvency that they provide for helping these individuals when their rights have been violated is potential negotiations. But at the point at which they don't, A, provide any examples of this having successfully happened in the past, without secession, and B, they don't actually characterize and mechanize how exactly you can come to table talks, how you can negotiate with an oppressive, imperialistic power that is holding you down and marginalizing you. We don't believe that this is true in their case, but I sense dissent.
We would tell you that you look at all of the examples we provided to you of when people attempt to secede, not because their democracy is being threatened, but simply because of ethnic and religious differences within that region.
Sure, so at the point at which the only response that the opposition has to our entire point about secession as a whole is providing examples of unsuccessful secessions in the past, we would tell you that this is fundamentally flawed and that they're not mechanizing as to why every single secession necessarily has to fail. And if you do want to play this game of example tennis, we can give you many examples of our own. Norway seceded from Sweden in 1905, Montenegro seceded from Serbia in 2006, Timor-Leste seceded from Indonesia in 2002. These are all examples of successful secessions in the past. At that point, contrary to anything that they tell you, not all secessions necessarily have to result in outright violence and war. Another example of a perfectly peaceful and stable secession that has lasted in the long term and had good effects is look to our example of the peaceful secession of Czechoslovakia in 1993. In the short term, there was minimal conflict, but in the long term, there was ensured stability because of the fact that they were able to secede in the first place. But then we also tell you that even if at their absolute highest ground, secession itself fails, the devolution of powers that follows is still better than before the situation that happened before, because local governments have more autonomy and more power than they ever had before. This has never been touched on by the opposition. Don't let them bring it up in the op blog. Here we tell you very, very clearly that at their highest ground, if secession itself fails and these people don't gain true independence, they still have more autonomy in that the governments are often likely to give them more rights, more individual freedoms, more local governments, and more ability to actually operate as they wish. This is simply not going to happen in their world. Finally, they try to characterize secessions as being constantly unsuccessful, but at the point at which they fail to explain why this happens, we see that it's really not a constant in their world. With that being said, let's move into the second and most important clash question in this debate, which is the principle debate. Here is where the proposition absolutely secures your ballot. We told you all the way back in PM an hour ago that our principle of self-determination operates independent of any consideration of the practical. That is to say that upholding this principle, which is a basic tenet of democracy, comes a priori to any practical impacts on either side. This means even on opposition's absolute highest ground, where you're buying all of the practical harms they try to tell us, you are still voting for the proposition on the basis of our principal argument of self-determination. A democracy is only as good as the people within it, and we fundamentally protect the inalienable rights of people to determine their own sense of being. So then let's look back to the three key facets within this point. First, we told you that democracies operate on the basis of consent, namely the consent of the people actually being governed. So their only response here was that they claim secession fundamentally robs and violates the social contract because the minority benefits at the cost of the majority. But the key failure they have here is in understanding that the social contract itself dictates that people have the right to replace an authoritarian government that violates their own inalienable rights and the fundamental promises that they made to them in the first place. So on their own ground of the social contract, we are also winning at the point at which they have conceded our characterization of secessions only happening when these rights have been violated in the first place. But then second, we told you that people have the autonomy to defend themselves and to prevent the infringement of these rights. This has never been touched upon, and it has never been actually proven as to why, by negotiations, they're able to actually achieve this autonomy and prevent the future infringements of rights. Finally, we told you that the principle of retribution is inherent to secession because people only secede when these rights have been fundamentally violated, and they don't explain how negotiations can actually make up the ground in bringing back these rights. But then also, on the principle level, as Alex told you in his speech, colonized groups and people are principally owed the right to be able to secede from the nations of their imperialistic powers and break the shackles of a legacy of undeniable oppression. Secession weakens imperial states and prevents further oppression and abuses of the seceding party. This crucially incites regional cooperations with neighboring states, but it also means that the imperial power itself, the one that was oppressing these marginalized groups that want to secede in the first place, is no longer so powerful that it can continue its oppressive practices. But then we would also tell you very clearly, on the same point of the principle, that at the point at which they're failing to actually achieve these and attain these unalienable rights and provide people with the ability to maintain them in the long term, that is at the point at which they're losing this debate. Any negative impacts they tell you come with secession, such as economic damages, more conflict, all of that, we tell you it does not happen in all cases. Look to the examples and the mechanizations with which we provided you. But second, even at their highest ground, if these happen, at the point at which they have a principal right to attempt secession and attempt to attain their rights, that is at the point the flames of democracy flicker brightest when we empower individuals to vote not just on their leaders, but on the very borders that define their political existence. It is on this basis that we are so incredibly proud to propose.
Now that the chair's suspicion that we still had pieces to add to this conversation have been confirmed, I would like to invite a member of the loyal opposition forward to continue the discussion. Opposition speaker number 3.
Violent extremism. This is a phrase you've heard a lot thrown at you from the debate from both sides of the House today. It's because we'd like to thank Side Proposition for doing all the work to show you why oppressive governments will never functionally not oppress their people, that we are so proud to stand on the opposition side of today's House. So in this speech, just 2 things. First, let's go through a brief clarification on framework before moving into the 3 key clash questions that describe to you why you're signing your ballot in confidence for opposition every single time. So what's the clarification we need to make on framework? We think there's been a fundamental mischaracterization throughout the debate about what a democratic right looks like. I want you to look at the first note of framing that we have given you in today's debate that has gone largely uncontested by Side Proposition. We tell you that at the point where a democratic right would impede on the ability of individuals to access democracy in the future, that is no longer a democratic right as it loses its prerequisite status. We think at the point where they haven't clashed with this, they have to engage with us a lot more on the actual impact level to show you how all of the democratic backsliding that comes out of their side of the House is mitigated to the point that still maintains this as a prerequisite for democracy. But even then, the second thing I think we tell you on framework is that Proposition 3 gets up here and tells you that secession is only ever a last resort. This is one, too late in the debate, and we would also tell you that it is fundamentally underdeveloped. We have given you many examples as why people will leave their countries without accessing other means first. If you are being fundamentally oppressed by a government who will never listen to you, why are you trying to negotiate in the first place on their side of the House per the warranting that they provided you? We think if their warranting about negotiation stands, the point about it being a last resort falls in today's debate. But then, what is the first key clash question that describes why we're winning today's debate? Let's understand why opposition is winning the principle. I think this comes down to a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be within a nation state. We would tell you that the social contract in a nation state is inherently harmful at the point where that social contract is applied to all individuals. I think that we would have to do a lot more in-depth analysis for you to vote for Side Proposition on the matter of the social contract. So why is that? We would win the social contract at the point where individuals in a social contract do not get to violate the liberties of others at the sake of their own consent. If individuals in the social contract can violate the liberties of others for themselves, there is no structure by which we actually preserve democracy. Democracy is not preserved at the point where society is so individualistic that there is no belief in the greater community or greater incentive, we tell you this out of the one, and they don't respond to it. But even if we don't buy that, we tell you we're winning on the principled level of argumentation at the point where we very clearly show you that this doesn't function as a prerequisite. We very clearly are stating to you that an individual's consent cannot come at the sake of the majority. We are telling you that at the point where individuals seceding from a state are harming those who still live in that state, even if their state is fine, that is a fundamental misrepresentation of what democracy looks like and should not be preferred. But then let's talk about some practical benefits on the second key clash question of today's debate. So why are we winning like the practical argument here? I think there's 3 reasons. So first, I think Proposition's case tension really comes out at the point of practical benefits. Remember what Proposition Speaker 1 and 2 tell you. They tell you that these governments are so corrupt, so evil, so deplorable that they will never work with the minorities, that they will never give them their rights. But then they tell you in the last part of the 2 and the 3 that those same governments are going to give those nations things when they secede. Those same governments are going to rebel against those minorities as they have done while they are in their home country. We think that's a fundamental misrepresentation of what it actually means when secession happens. We think that if this is true, none of their practical impacts in the round stand today. You will note here that at the point where their only principal prerequisite point has been disproven, they cannot win this debate. But before I get into the second key reason that we're winning the practicals on democracy, I'll take it.
Panel, note that when governments devolve their powers, it's out of necessity in response to secession, not benevolence.
Let's talk about this. I think this is going to come up a little bit more in our third clash question, but just to touch on this, we would tell you that at the point where these individuals are so much more powerful than the seceding state, because they are being continuously characterized as minority groups by side proposition, those people do not have to be benevolent or devolve their powers to those individuals. There is no clear incentive on the proposition side of the House for this to happen. But the second key reason that we're winning the practical benefits of democracy are because even if you buy that those nations living in a state that has seceded have all of their democratic rights fulfilled, have a system that works for them, we would tell you the conditions for individuals living in that nation state get far worse. Remember what we tell you in our second substantive argument. Governments don't take kindly to being rebelled against, specifically the authoritarian ones that Proposition is so desperate to talk about in today's debate. At the point where that is true, we would tell you that fundamentally, even if the minorities that get out are fine, we're concerned about the minorities that are still living in that country and the treatment that they face. We think this is a key part on the flow that Proposition has just under-engaged. But then the third reason we're winning practical benefits comes kind of at this apex where we're believing the fact that these individuals are always minorities. We tell you in the 1, in the 2, and it goes completely unresponded to, that there are many instances where these individuals are not always oppressed minorities. At the point where we have proven to you that minority status, that oppression is not inherent to secession, we would tell you that all of their impacting about how it is democratically necessary goes out the window. We would win the principle of democracy on this point, but we win it on a practical level because individuals in these nation states are no longer actually upholding democracy. There is no guarantee that they are going to solve for that backsliding. So then, what's the third key clash question? Let's talk about when secession doesn't work, because I think we've gotten really hung up on this in the last minute of the day's debate. I think that when secession doesn't work, this looks like an authoritarian government, as Proposition characterizes to you, rebelling against the people who challenge them. It is so intuitive that authoritarian governments are not going to take kindly to being objected on. We would tell you that at the point where that is true, you would reference our third substantive argument about the conditions in these states when nations don't get to leave. When we are talking about a greater conversation in terms of democracy, we have an obligation not just to look at the group that is the most idealistic for us. If one country is facing such major backsliding at the result of another group of people trying to gain their democratic rights, we would tell you there is probably a better way to ensure democracy that is only accessible on the opposition side of the House. So why do we win this point? We would tell you that even if devolution of powers happens, an authoritarian state will just devolve its authoritarianism into smaller factions. We don't think this is preferable in any realm very clearly, but we would also note that all of the links we have given you in our third substantive have gone completely dropped that tell you about how these people are rebelled against internally if they don't actually get to leave, hurting their democracy in the long run. If we assume they get their democracy, we're still worried about the democracy of the individual staying in the state. Could not be more proud to oppose.
As we finalize this discussion among friends, I invite the reply speaker from side opposition.
I've never really been scared of planes. I know a lot of people are. Air travel was really scary in some senses, but never been me. But recently, when I flew on a plane from Indiana to Arizona to be here on the stage in front of you today, I noticed a few really weird things. First thing was that on our plane into the desert of Arizona, the mountains, the dry land, there was a lifeboat to help us if a plane crashed. I wasn't really sure about that. I was thinking, how exactly would that help us? Because I think a lifeboat would actually just make things worse if you were to be in a plane crash situation. But the reality is that that lifeboat was there, but we just didn't have to use it. And any chance that we did have to use it, it would be helpful, but not on my personal flight because I knew it would make things worse. It is because we value providing people with mechanisms for successful democratic nations and not life rafts in a desert that we are so proud to oppose today. In this speech, I'm just going to be doing one thing. I'll be characterizing both the world of the proposition and the opposition and telling our panel of judges today exactly why you promote the opposition in every single case. So let's look at this a little bit closely. Let's look at the proposition world. The first thing I want to talk about are the economic, social, and fatal harms they propose on their side of the House. There is no dissent within this debate today about the impact of these harms, how it would have on civilians, and how especially it would have on people who did not want this conflict to begin with. Make no mistake, Judge, what they are proposing today is war. Any kind of secession from a country is not going to be peaceful, as those two groups obviously do not agree with each other. There is going to be conflict, there is going to be violence, and there is going to be death. This is unavoidable on the proposition side of the House. We regularly acknowledge that war is one of the worst things humans have ever had to face. So why would we live in a world, in any world, where a world governing body not only condones it, but supports it? Next, moving on to the idea of the social contract. In the proposition world, we have this lack of a social contract. As my partner Claire pointed out during her third speech, and I pointed out during my second speech, you cannot take away consent from someone else the same way you can withdraw consent for yourself. This is not how a social contract works in a democracy. The proposition is proposing in today's debate that people should be able to do this, that they should be able to inflict their will upon people who do not feel the same way. We fundamentally disagree with this, judges. The third thing I want to talk about, what looks like in the world of the proposition, was the idea of a threat of an event. This was addressed within my second speech, and my partner Claire brought it up to little to no rebuttal or refutation. We have to look at the fact that this motion today entails governments versus the people. We understand this is an uneven fight. Governments have more resources, money, and military to go against the people, so we know that this fight against government and people will not end well for the people. As my Claire pointed out, the proposition spends so much time telling you exactly why all governments are corrupt. So at the point where all governments are corrupt, even the threat of secession would end up with more deaths, more violence, and more fatality against people who do not only not deserve it, but did not ask for it. We cannot have this on this side of the House. Now, moving over, let's look at the opposition side of the House. On the opposition, we promote the principles of democracy. In every single sense of the word, we have to have an equal vote, an equal say in every one of what is happening during their country and to which they have citizenship to. We promote this on the opposition side of the House, while the proposition puts this in the ground. Next, let's look at the idea of secession still being a right. This has been addressed back and forth throughout today, but I want to make this very clear, judges. Secession is still a right just as much as a lifeboat on an airplane is a right. We have this for us, we have this as a principle of our democracy, but that does not mean in any case that a House, a world governing body, should be promoting its use. In fact, we should be condoning it. We are not taking away rights on the opposition side of the House, but instead we are given putting forth a prevention measure for conflict from happening and promote peace in all countries all over the world. Thank you.
The chair thanks the loyal opposition for steadfastly defending their viewpoint and would like to invite the reply speaker for proposition to come forward and conclude our discussion today.
We began this debate with a very simple premise, that the freedom of political association inhered in the human condition, that it was essential we could choose which political communities we belong to because it had an incredible amount of influence over our lives, controlled by a state monopoly on violence. You were forced to pay taxes, forced to follow laws because that state exerted violence on you. And if you were a minority, that violence was likely to be used in arbitrary ways, especially under the authoritarian regimes that they so wanted to place this debate under. But even if it wasn't, state monopoly on violence was only justified if you consented to that state in the first place, and if you at any point in time had the option to opt out. If you no longer consented, you should be able to leave. On that basis, very proud to propose. A couple of things I want to note here in this reply. The easiest place you can propose was on the principal argument. Look, we were consistent since the very first minute of Cam's speech to the very last minute of mine. We never said practical arguments have no ground in the round. There were 4 things here. Number 1, on self-determination, things like agency, autonomy, and your right to existence. Crucially, this had nothing to do with consent or arguing or agreeing to social contracts to begin with. I think the fact that the only way they can frame and answer this principle in op block, very, very late to solidify that, by the way, was restrained by government contracts and mandates. That is the only lens through which they understood this principle. I think that's indicative of the fact that they missed the boat of it to begin with, that things like self-determination were inalienable and had nothing to do with whether or not you were a citizen of a government and had nothing to do with what kind of system you lived in the first place. The second thing we told you was on retribution. We told you that when governments and imperial regimes have gained their power and legitimacy with plunder, colonialism, and violence, that was the third substantive. The most vulnerable and really only stakeholder that mattered was what the violated group wanted to do. That was weighing done in DPM. Thirdly, let's have the consent debate. There were 2 pushbacks here. Number 1, they say, but you also consent to others in a country, whatever that means. First of all, those others are probably partly responsible for your oppression, partly responsible for your ethnic disconnect, for your ethnic disillusionment, or trying to force ethnic homogeneity, which is the exact example they try to keep claiming is also a reason for seceding, depriving those individuals of legitimacy to begin with. When they break the contract first, you can too. But also, our analysis operated above theirs, because we told you consent can fundamentally be revoked regardless of whether or not you have consented to other people to begin with. Just because you consent once does not mean next week it automatically applies. Especially it's true in the interim if the terms of your consent have changed. If in that week the terms of the thing that you agreed to in the first place have altered, then that consent is no longer valid. The second pushback they had is, let's look at the practical, let's look at the empirical examples. First of all, they're the only ones saying practical debate is all that matters in this debate, and frankly, they're right. The motion says this House, as a democratic people, would secede. Oh, wait, sorry. It says this House supports a people's democratic right to secede to begin with. We can play example tennis too, but this debate operated on the principle and beliefs motion of the level. That's why we were proud to win on that argument. Their third and final pushback was violence and war. Look, this really only got explained in the op block. Their 01 was just like war and violence happens on your side. There was no explanation for it whatsoever. Then they try to claim that negotiations somehow happen on their side. However, we told you that governments know they will be repressed and can only work through them in the first place. Secondly, we told you that 100% of the leverage, the power, etc., is going to be going to the government. So if you're rebellious, you then turn to things like war and conflict under their side of the house. We told you that because secession movements don't just rise out of thin air, this argument didn't really work. Secondly, the reason why we do is because we have supported their secession. Things like international funding, global recognition, NGO aid, worldwide pressure. That looks like connections and sanctions and trade alliances. That was also what supports meant in the motion, and we characterized that since the very, very first speech. We believed that the rejection of secession is oppression, and that is why we propose. We should shake hands.
The chair thanks our friends from both sides of the aisle, and as they leave the stage, my co-chair will come forward.